This is hell.
Oh, so did you notice that the wealthy only got wealthier since the pandemic began? Well, we can expect the same as climate change worsens and the already rich line their pockets with even more riches. That is, unless something is done about it and soon. But that may be even more difficult than we may already imagine it will be. After all, there's so much secrecy around the wealth of the wealthy. We don't even know what political movements they are funding or whose campaigns they are bankrolling. It's as if their wealth exists above the law. Here to help us better understand the wealth of the richest families in the United States and how it stays that way, returning to This Is Hell. Chuck Collins is co-author of the Institute for Policy Studies report, Silver Spoon, Oligarchs, How America's 50 Largest Inherited Wealth Dynasties Accelerate Inequality. Welcome back to This Is Hell, Chuck.
Hey, Chuck, great to be with you.
It's great to be with you, too. Always great to talk to somebody who has a beautiful first name like Chuck.
I know. And reminding me that we talked in 2006 in Oaxaca when I was living in Oaxaca. Now there's memory lane. Thanks for that.
Yeah. I'm thinking we might share that interview as well, because that was a really great interview. So the report states much of the media's focus today is on new wealth billionaires, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and Elon Musk, who have become centibillionaires in their lifetimes. These splashy first-generation fortunes understandably dominate the news. Musk's wealth, for example, increased by more than $100 billion during the first 9 months of the pandemic in 2020. These new fortunes feed into the country's self-image as an entrepreneurial mobile society rather than a caste-based society with historically reinforced patterns of income and wealth inequality. Lurking behind these dynamics, first-generation stories, however, are persistent examples of even greater multi-generational dynastic wealth, with some of these family fortunes accelerating over the last century. So, here, Musk's wealth increased by more than $100 billion during the first 9 months of the pandemic. So, Chuck, were people just rushing out to buy electric cars?
Well, in that case, the stock market is always betting on the future. Where's things going to go? And obviously they bet on Musk because, well, he's future oriented. He's building, batteries. He's thinking about a post-oil economy. But as you said, I was just looking at the statistics this morning. The billionaires in the United States during the pandemic have seen their wealth go up almost $2.1 trillion. $2.1 trillion. The last number we reported was 1.8. Total U.S. billionaire wealth is just about to hit 5 trillion this week. So they have done extraordinarily well, and most of their wealth gains of the last 40 years have happened during the pandemic.
The report states in healthy, equitable, democratic societies, great fortunes dissipate over a few generations. But, we've been told by those who oppose inheritance taxes that death taxes punish the wealthy and their children for their success. How punishing are inheritance taxes? Do they disincentivize the pursuit of wealth?
No. And actually, the original intent 100 years ago of what we call the estate tax, the U.S. inheritance tax, was to raise revenue, but it was primarily to put a brake on these democracy distorting concentrations of wealth. And for, several generations, it did do that. It did discourage that concentration of wealth. These are families that are, enormously wealthy. They may have started businesses. It's not a disincentive. Nobody would tell you that a tax at their death is a disincentive to create, a better mousetrap or work hard during their lifetime. What it does do is it crimps their ability to pass fortunes on to their children, unlimited fortunes. People are still passing on, even with the estate tax, a lot of wealth. And now the estate tax is almost a joke. As Gary Cohn, Trump's White House official, said, only morons pay the estate tax, meaning the wealthy have figured out ways to plan around it.
So the report finds that our country's wealth is accumulating in fewer hands. Those hands often belong to members of a tiny number of dynastically wealthy families, people who may be 2, 3, or in some cases 7 generations removed from the original source of their wealth. why should we not incentivize the maintaining of wealth? Isn't maintaining wealth the earning of an income, which is what this system is supposed to incentivize?
Well, I think that there's, if we're concerned about incentives, there are plenty of incentives for people to work and accumulate wealth. What we should be concerned about is when that wealth becomes so great that it's not that people are buying yachts, it's they're buying senators, that they're using that wealth and power to rig the rules to get more wealth and power. And that's usually, somewhere along the line of the second generation starts to focus on the fact that, we're not like Sam Walton, we're not like the founder of the company, we're just coasting on that wealth. And then they become incredibly obsessed with defending their wealth and getting in there and warping the political system and rigging the rules. And so that's the the purpose of this report in a way is to say, let's look at these huge inherited wealth dynasties, what's happening with them and why we should be concerned. And why is it that some families seem to be focused on dynastic wealth accumulation and others are not?
The report also states that we understandably admire entrepreneurs who invent things or build companies, almost always with crucial help from colleagues, workers, and taxpayer-funded infrastructure. But at a certain stage, some of these creators or their descendants shift resources to consolidate their wealth, fend off competition, and create monopolies. They focus less on creating new wealth and more on preserving existing systems that extract ongoing rents from consumers and the real economy. But, Chuck, we're told that these are the job creators. So what is the impact on the overall economy of preserving existing systems that extract ongoing rents from consumers and the real economy? And what is the impact on you and me?
Well, one impact, and I think you summarized it well, is people use their market power and their wealth to create monopolies, to shut down competition, to snuff out competitors, and in some ways to block innovation. So that has consequences on the larger economy. We saw that early on with Microsoft. When Microsoft at a certain point became so powerful, it started to use its market share and power to either buy up the competition and absorb them, or kind of promote their inferior products at different times. And then, in terms of wealthy individuals, well, they go out and they hire, what we call the wealth defense industry, the tax attorneys and accountants and lawyers and family office staff. And their entire focus is on accumulation and preservation. And so again, they get in there and they start rigging the rules to, get rid of the inheritance tax, get rid of taxes on income from capital, and protect their advantages for their children and their grandchildren. And you start to see that in higher education and selective colleges. The rich are occupying a huge percentage of the seats in the most selective colleges in the land. They're essentially blocking opportunity for non-rich people to have the same opportunities that they had. And that's the corruption of dynastic wealth.
The report also points out that America's dynastic families, both old and new, are deploying a range of wealth preservation strategies to further concentrate wealth and power that is deployed to influence democratic institutions, depress civic imagination, and rig the rules to further enrich inequality. There's this phrase that there is no alternative. Do you think that what's the role that the wealthy play in making people believe that there is no alternative? What's the role that it plays in limiting our political imagination?
Well, in a way, it's the way in which dynastically wealthy people promote certain narratives. I mean, you've actually said some of them already. You don't want to punish success, and wealthy people are the job creators, and these are the most productive and important people in the society, on and on down the list. And the whole idea that you shouldn't tax wealth because that will kill the goose that laid the golden egg. There's a whole sort of worldview, if you will, that goes along with preserving and protecting existing wealth. And it is useful to make a distinction. Actually, you asked me about Elon Musk. Well, Elon Musk is, he is in the you could say he's sort of in the productive phase of his wealth accumulation. He actually doesn't really care that much, as best as I can tell, about his money. He's focused on, creating things, whether it's satellite internet or Tesla batteries or, rockets and that sort of thing. It's probably, we should be concerned in another 10 years when he starts to say, oh, wow, I have so much money. Now what am I going to do? When they start thinking about their legacy, if you will, or protecting their market position, then we should be very, very concerned. And when we start to see Elon Musk's children and grandchildren, which I imagine they're going to have some pretty interesting names, based on what he named his first child, those children will be flexing their cultural muscle long after he's gone. So that's where, we have to make a distinction between, there is, sometimes people do create a better mousetrap and should be rewarded, up to a point, in my view. But do their children and grandchildren, should they never have to work again in their life? Should their great grandchildren have a giant foundation that dominates our civic life? Those are when we start talking about dynasty and sort of the creation of a wealth oligarchy, that's when we should really be concerned, in my mind.
Wait, Chuck, I forgot. What is Elon Musk's kid's name?
It's I can't pronounce it. It's a formula.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
We can look that one up while we're talking, but it's literally like a formula.
That's crazy. So the report also points out that the tax avoidance means less support for the infrastructure we all rely on to preserve our health, safety, and quality of life. But are these dynastic family fortunes large enough so they do not have to rely on the infrastructure the rest of us do? Does our infrastructure matter to them?
Well, it does to some extent, to particularly around property rights, enforcement of intellectual property laws. There's a whole way in which our publicly funded system does, these are still people who sell their products. Some of them travel over the roads and highways and public infrastructure. But what happens with the super wealthy is they sort of do begin to de-link from the commonwealth, if you will. The children go to private schools, not public schools. They have their own estates and forests. They don't need parks. They don't need libraries, public libraries. They have all the books they ever want, So they begin to privatize their needs and withdraw their power and political support for public investments that non-rich people kind of depend on. But they're in some ways we're still all webbed together because the communications infrastructure, even the internet, was built with public investments. There's a fair amount of public infrastructure that we all depend on, whether we admit it or not.
The report finds the emergence of wealth dynasties undermines how self-governing societies organize meaningful tax systems, raise revenue, and make public investments. Inherited wealth dynasties have benefited from a wealth-hiding system facilitated by a powerful wealth defense industry that enables the wealthy to move their money around the world and escape accountability. But now, as the Pandora Papers show, they don't have to send it anywhere. They can hide it in tax havens, shell companies here in the United States and several states. But it's been an explosion of such tax shelters for the rich in South Dakota. The U.S. has used their law enforcement, according to the report, to shut down tax havens in places like the Bahamas. And the U.S. is still working on shutting down tax havens around the world while allowing states here in the U.S. to be tax havens. We've been talking about tax avoidance and dynastic wealth's impact on democracy. What happens to a democracy, Chuck, when it facilitates the tax avoidance by the wealthy and politically powerful from around the world?
Yeah. Well, there are so many harms, and I know you already spoke about the Pandora Papers, but this is where it overlaps. That when wealthy people don't pay their fair share of taxes, basically they are shifting the bill onto the rest of us. So whether it's caring for veterans or public infrastructure or higher education, when rich people don't pay their fair share, everyone else is stuck with the bill, or we're stuck with austerity. the hospital that wasn't built, the pothole that wasn't filled. So that's clearly one thing. But this system of wealth hiding, and I wrote a book, Chuck, called "The Wealth Hoarders: How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Trillions," and it's sort of about this whole phenomena. But this is the system that allows the plundering of the global South. So if you're a dictator in the global South, or actually, let's you and I have spoken about Mexico over the years. There are 3,000 wealthy people and politically connected people unmasked in the Pandora Papers. Many of them work in the current or previous administrations, presidential administrations. These are people who are running large public works projects and the like, and they're skimming money off, and they're taking it to a law firm in Panama or the British Virgin Islands, and they're creating a shell company, and then they're funneling the money and buying real estate in the United States, or they're bringing it to a dynasty trust in South Dakota. So in a sense, the United States, by becoming a tax haven, a place where wealthy people can hide their money, we're now accomplices to that heist. We're accomplices and facilitators of that plunder, where the wealth of nations is being taken away. So that's another one of the harms that this hidden wealth system enables.
So then, is the United States undermining democracy, not just here in the United States, but around the world?
Absolutely. I mean, this is, again, every society should have the ability to pass laws to tax their own wealthy and then make investments in health infrastructure and the like. And our sort of hidden wealth system undercuts those societies. For every dollar of aid that goes to Africa, $2 to $3 of plunder is taken out through this system of anonymous shell companies and corporations taking the natural resource wealth of a nation. So yeah, this system destabilizes societies and their democratic aspirations, their self-governance, basically.
I want to share some of the data that you found. You write that for the 27 families that were on both the Forbes 400 list in 1983 and the Forbes Billion Dollar Dynasties list in 2020, their combined assets have grown by 1,007% over those 37 years. This is a sturdy average annual growth rate of 6.7% per year. This growth has hardly wavered through the years. The combined assets of these 27 families grew 99% over just the most recent 11 years, from 2009 to 2020. This is an average annual growth rate of 6.5%, almost exactly in line with their nearly 40-year average. In contrast, median family wealth for the typical family in the United States increased by just 93% in inflation-adjusted dollars between 1989 and 2019, the most recent year for which data is available, for an average growth rate of just 1.8%, again, compared to the 6.5%, which is nearly the 40-year average for the wealthiest. So is this unique historically to the past 40 years? Because that lines up with the beginning of Reaganism, Thatcherism, neoliberalism, whatever you want to call the change in tax policy and deprioritization of social services that began in the early 80s. So is this a relatively new situation historically? And if so, what does it reveal to you about changes that have happened in the past 40 years?
Well, it is new in if you look over the last century, there was a period of dynastic wealth after the Industrial Revolution. So let's say, 1880 to 1915 or so, before the First World War, there was a very similar pattern. And that's where the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Mellons and some of these, kind of late 19th century dynastic fortunes emerged at that time. But then, 1915, 1916, we start an income tax, we have an inheritance tax, we have a Great Depression, we have two world wars, and we have essentially 6 or 7 decades of relative equality, where you didn't see these growing dynastic fortunes. You didn't see, huge concentrations of wealth emerging. And so you're right, starting in the late 70s, early 80s, the Reaganomics, but even prior to that, we started to see this pulling apart. So yeah, essentially what you described is these dynastically wealthy families saw their wealth grow 10 times the rate of ordinary families. And by the way, those ordinary families still include a lot of wealthy families. So, compared to income for most people, these folks are taking off on a rocket launcher. I mean, the number of households that have zero or negative wealth is almost 1 out of 5 households now. So these trends are a reflection, Chuck, as you describe, of this 40 years of pulling apart that we've been living through.
We are speaking with Chuck Collins. He is a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies and co-author of the IPS report, Silver Spoon: Oligarchs, How America's 50 Largest Inherited Wealth Dynasties Accelerate Inequality. So the report states that only 4 of the top 20 wealth dynasties are new to the list since 1983. And between 2015 and 2020, the only family to see its rank decline significantly was the opioid-pushing Sackler family, which fell from number 16 to number 30, thanks in large part to a number of high-profile legal settlements by their family-owned corporation, Purdue Pharma. So it's been the same families for 40 years, and it took record-setting litigation over millions of addictions and deaths to drop one of those families from number 15 to number 30. What does the Sackler family court decision that finds them, but does not hold them accountable, what does that say to you about our entrenched dynastic family wealth in the United States?
Well, I would say that it's entrenched, that it's persistent, that it's very hard to sort of meaningfully break up those powerful dynasties once they form, because this wealth is power, and they deploy that power to protect their wealth. And, at the expense of the rest of us, at the expense of equality of opportunity for the rest of us. Think about that. The Sacklers, whose wealth, it has come from the mass suffering of so many, and even still they don't accept responsibility for that, and they continue to be multi-billionaires. Their children and grandchildren will continue to be incredibly wealthy, wealth that came from the opioid epidemic.
And, as you point out, as we were talking about earlier, billionaires are making a fortune off of the pandemic as well. So it seems like they're constantly making fortunes off crises. We know that we are already living within climate change, but climate change is going to worsen and worsen. So are billionaires right now set up to make a fortune again off of yet another crisis?
Well, it's not surprising to see some of the wealthiest, dynastically wealthy families in the country buying land, huge amounts of land, buying water rights, purchasing property in different parts of the world, whether it's New Zealand or the Rocky Mountains or Canadian provinces where there's, abundant natural resources. Dynastic families think multi-generational. They can afford to, and they think they're spotting these disruptions, these trends, and they're thinking not just how do we make money off of them, but how do we survive and flourish while everyone else is literally treading water. So it's not surprising to see that some of these families are positioning themselves to take advantage of the next disruption.
The report states that the Koch, Brown, Walton, Marriott, and Simplot families have set up their own corporate political action committees, PACs, which give millions to political candidates and campaigns on both sides of the aisle. If their project is bipartisan, how insulated is the unfair tax system from reform?
Well, again, these families, when they think about their wealth and how to influence the political system, they have a whole range of tools. They can give directly to candidates. They can give to think tanks to shape the conversation. They can give to dark money political action committees where they don't have to disclose their influence. They can give to tax exempt charities, so they can even get tax breaks, give to their own foundations, and have those foundations, whether it's endow a chair at a university that's must teach their perspective, or think tanks that advocate a certain worldview. They have found ways essentially to weaponize all the ways in which they can deploy their wealth, and that's partly, again, the way they wield power, and even their charities, which we know that the Koch brothers have figured out how to weaponize their tax exempt money that they give to their own charities and take tax breaks. They have figured out how to deploy that to advance their narrow interests.
The report states that members of dynastically wealthy families wield not only a great deal of direct financial power, but power in the form of philanthropy as well, as you were just saying. So how successful is philanthropy at obfuscating any gain in the power of the wealthiest? Is that why we may not recognize the power of the wealthiest because of philanthropy? Is that the point of it?
Well, I think, there are probably very wealthy people who genuinely have a philanthropic impulse, and they're giving money to things because they think it's the right thing to do. But philanthropy has also become kind of a virtue washing. It's a way in which wealthy people can sanitize their relationships. I mean, this goes way back. I mean, think about Andrew Carnegie, and his steelworks, and his union bashing. He was an SOB in terms of how he made his money, but at the end of his life, he became Mr. Public Library, right? Mr. Carnegie Endowment for Peace and International Relations. His philanthropic legacy is also what people remember, and maybe they forget just how ruthless he was when he was building his businesses. And same with the Sacklers. People speculate that, the Sacklers gave, billions of dollars to charities, particularly arts institutions all around the world and in the United States. And that in some ways it buffered them from the appropriate scrutiny that probably should have started much sooner as to how they were making their money. Philanthropy can sometimes distract us from the questions of how has this money been made, and is this philanthropy turning our heads? Is it funding certain things but not other things? I mean, it's very rare to find wealthy philanthropists who fund things that would increase tax fairness, that would help worker rights, that would diminish their own wealth and power. It tends to be reinforcing the status quo. So philanthropy is not a solution. It's sometimes part of the problem.
Is the only way you can have a charitable foundation to allow for those foundations that are far less charitable, like the Kochs, that only become a place to warehouse assets? Is that the difficulty here, that the only way that we can, without the rules that allow for the charitable foundations like the Kochs, there wouldn't be charitable foundations?
Yeah, basically it's the same system that truly benevolent foundations use. Now, at the Institute for Policy Studies, we have a whole charity reform initiative, because one of the things we've seen, even during the pandemic, is private foundation, wealthy people give their money to intermediaries. You and me and Alex and other people, if we have any extra money, we give it straight to the charity. We give it to the food bank or to your local public radio station or whatever. You're giving directly to the charity. But what wealthy people do is they park the money in their own private foundations and donor advised funds and tend to warehouse it. And they immediately get a tax break when they put their money into the charitable institution. And foundations are only required to pay out 5% a year, and that can include overhead, right? So that can include paying my kid to work at the office or whatever. I mean, so the money's not really flowing; it's being warehoused. And we proposed, especially during the pandemic, that foundations should pay out at a higher rate, and they shouldn't be able to give to closely affiliated organizations, and they probably shouldn't be used for gifts over a certain threshold. You have these billionaires who are saying, oh, I'm creating, my foundation in my image, and I'm putting all my billions into it. And that means that money will never be taxed, ever. And that there's something broken about that. So I think we do need to change the rules governing philanthropy, modernize them to protect democracy from narrowly controlled philanthropy.
Are the rules that do govern philanthropy now, are they relatively new, or is it just that the billionaires today have far better legal services and accounting services, and they can find the loopholes?
No, the framework for the current structure of private foundations, donor-advised funds, what qualifies as a charity, was created in 1969, which relative in U.S. history was probably one of the most relatively equal times in U.S. history. So those folks could not have anticipated this incredible growth of concentrated wealth and power. And that's been a steady trend that we've certainly studied is charitable giving by low and middle income people has gone down, in part because people are feeling more economically insecure. Almost all the growth in philanthropic giving is by the rich. And so the rich are starting to flex their power muscles through charity. But we would argue, increased payout, require donor advised funds to have a payout. They don't even have a payout. Require that money move within a certain period of time, and cap the amount you can deduct. Maybe it's $500 million, So if Mark Zuckerberg wants to give $10 billion to charity, he's only going to get a tax break for $500 million of that. That some of that's going to go to the Treasury to pay for public infrastructure, because philanthropy is not a substitute for a fair tax system and public investment.
The report says that the Waltons, the Marshalls, and Mellons have used their foundations to fund nonprofit public policy organizations advocating for reducing taxes on the wealthy, as well as rolling back the corporate taxes and environmental regulations that constrain the profits of their family businesses. Some, such as the Kochs and Mellons, use their foundation to funnel millions to donor-advised funds, charitable giving vehicles with no payout requirement and little transparency, which can be used to fund anonymous, unlimited political advocacy. Why do these donations, why does this funding of political movements, why is this so secret? And is that a protection that is a protection that's good for all of democracy, for everybody, not just for the rich?
Well, it shouldn't be secret, but some wealthy people find ways to do that. For instance, there's a donor-advised fund consortium called Donors Trust, which is a huge funder of right-wing organizing, funding groups, white supremacist groups, funding amicus briefs to defend, Supreme Court justices who are, conservatives. So, and donors can kind of launder the money, if you will, through these anonymous donor-advised funds. But most typically, it's a transparent system. You should, a foundation files an annual report and it says where the money goes. But here they're layering it up with these other giving intermediaries. So that is something that should also be fixed. There should be greater transparency. I mean, again, Chuck, think about this. We are subsidizing through our tax system these donors. And in fact, the richer you are, the bigger the tax breaks. We estimate for every dollar that a billionaire gives to their own charity, say, we as taxpayers are chipping in 74 cents in lost tax revenue. So there's a genuine public interest in knowing where the money's going and putting some guardrails up to protect our democracy, protect our society from yet another form of power that the wealthy wield.
The report states numerous ways dynastic families protect their wealth. One is form a family office to sequester wealth. Family offices are in the dynastic wealth business. Their central mission is the preservation of wealth and the maximization of the transmission of wealth to future generations. Families setting up offices include many of the top 50 on the Forbes list. Today's wealthy families are laying the groundwork for their own future dynasties by using this tool that has proven advantageous for those in the past. There are now an estimated 10,000 family offices worldwide, and about half were founded within the last 15 years. Even Oprah has a family office, OW Management LLC. Is there any sign this kind of tool, family offices, was the result of lobbying that was funded by the wealthiest families?
Well, there are examples where the family office industry has fended off any kind of oversight and regulation. And they are in and of themselves huge pools of unregulated capital. Estimates are there's some $6-7 trillion in family offices. There's nothing necessarily inherently diabolical about a family office. It's like forming, a corporation to manage your affairs. But some of them have become, major investors and kind of unaccountable forms of capital. But yeah, the fact is, wealthy people, and you need about $250 million or more to be able to justify having a family office that's your own single family office. And think about that. There's 10,000 of them around the world, and everybody, all the super rich, everybody has a family office now. It's like sort of where they bring their services in house. But even some of the wealthiest families, going back to the 1900s, the Rockefeller family, they have opened up their family office to other wealthy families that maybe don't have quite as much money, so that they can also manage it. And the Phipps family, which goes back to Andrew Carnegie's steel industry, started something called the Bessemer Trust. And now they have 2,500 families whose assets are managed by the Bessemer Trust, including they were custodian of Taylor Swift, right? So we know what happened to Taylor Swift, and that basically her father, but along with this family office, the Bessemer Trust kind of ran her finances. So these are the ways in which wealthy families sort of organize to lower their taxes and pass on as much wealth as possible to the next generation.
The report states that we can assume that families with accelerating wealth over generations are avoiding substantial estate taxes, and many are deploying tax planning devices to push wealth into trusts that are exempt from the tax. So, Chuck, what impact does raising taxes on the rich have if they have all these other tools to hide their wealth from taxes? Does this make raising taxes on the wealthy ineffective at fighting inequality?
It does. It means several things. It means that our estimates of inequality are probably too low, meaning that the concentration of wealth is much bigger. We estimate somewhere between 25 and $36 trillion is now hidden in trusts and in offshore tax havens. So this is here where Congress is debating, Joe Biden's proposal to, increase infrastructure and make other investments that, are long overdue. And the plan is to pay for them by increasing taxes on the wealthy, which is very popular. 70-80% of the public supports that. And yet this hidden wealth system, this kind of dynasty-friendly tax system, if you will, or hidden wealth system, is the reason why it's not going to be effective. It will undermine our ability to tax the wealthy.
So 70 to 80% of Americans polled say that they would like to see income taxes on the wealthiest increase, but we only have two political parties here in the United States that have any real power. Do you think people would actually shift their allegiance from one party to another based on increasing taxes for the wealthy?
Yeah, I think what's fascinating right now is, it hasn't always been the case that taxing the wealthy is the most popular policy. And so, the Republicans are always opposed to taxing the wealthy. That's their constituency. And Democrats are always incredibly nervous or gun shy, and the moderate Democrats run the other way from progressive tax policies. But this is a moment where actually it's incredibly popular. Like, people are like, yeah, we wanted the infrastructure bill. And then when they hear that it'll be paid for by increasing taxes on the rich and global companies, they're like, oh, it's even better, you know? So this is a moment when Democrats, who support raising taxes should be out front, because it's incredibly popular. And why is it popular? It's because people have totally woken up to these inequalities, why they matter, how they undercut the quality of life for non-rich people, and how the rich are playing games. And, the Pandora Papers is just the latest, but not the only example of how the super rich game the tax code and pay so little. So this is definitely a moment when it's popular.
Another way in which dynastic family wealth is protected, according to your report, is use your unique political connections, which I imagine you can create by having your own family corporation PAC. The report then offers the example of Ray Lee Hunt, the patriarch of the Hunt family, a major supporter of former President George W. Bush. Hunt gave big to Bush's presidential candidacy and his private foundation. He also served on Bush's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board and the board of the George W. Bush Presidential Center. In 2007, these contributions paid off when Hunt made a deal with the Kurdistani government to buy oil fields in Iraq worth as much as $14 billion. The arrangement directly conflicted with U.S. policy, which states that only the central government of Iraq has the ability to enter into contracts. But there is evidence that the Bush administration was aware of the deal before it was signed. And in spite of congressional questioning, it still stands today. This suggests that dynastic family wealth and the political connections it can create put those families and the way they earn money above the law. Are there any calls to end allowing a billionaire to violate U.S. policy in Iraq? How much does our tax system put billionaires and wealthy families above the law?
Well, it's just another part of the political corruption of our democracy when you have, whether it's the Hunt family example or the Koch brothers able to block changes in climate policy, or other, dynastic families sort of flexing their muscles in that way. We should constantly be reminding ourselves this is about power. It's not, we're not just concerned about this wealth and, it'd be great if some of that wealth was fairly taxed and invested. But the real fear here is dynastic power, oligarchic power, multi-generational inherited wealth power. And, the French economist Thomas Piketty said, if we don't intervene in the system, if we don't figure out how to tax inherited wealth, if we don't figure out how to limit the power of wealth, 20 years from now, the sons and daughters of today's billionaires will dominate our politics, culture, philanthropy, and the economy. It'll be more corrupt than it currently is.
The report points out that one in particular, Donors Trust, of these donor sites that they can put money, was set up intentionally as a pass-through funnel for libertarian donors who want to support organizations advocating for aggressive free market economic policy. Although their current statement of principles has been somewhat watered down, their original message or mission was clear: to ensure the intent of donors who are dedicated to the ideals of limited government, personal responsibility, and free enterprise. Do limited government, personal responsibility, and free enterprise all benefit dynastic family wealth more than any other segment of the population? And are limited government, personal responsibility, and free enterprise about keeping the wealthiest wealthy, which undermines social services, infrastructure, social mobility, while enforcing inequality and unfairness?
Yeah, no, it is a very self-serving agenda. Let's just be clear. And you see families, going back to 2001, I was involved in an effort to try to keep Congress from abolishing the estate tax, the inheritance tax. And there was this whole end the death tax movement. And when I started to figure out who was on the other side, it was the Gallo family, the Walton family, the Mars Candy family. The Mars family, based in Virginia, basically funded a campaign to abolish Virginia's estate tax successfully. They got rid of it. So they spent millions to save themselves billions. And that's where you really see and these are second generation. You don't see the first generation wealth folks out there worried so much about it's the second generation who doesn't have the ability to create that wealth. They're just coasting on the glory of past generations.
So what does bipartisan support, seemingly, for all of this dynastic wealth, what does that say to you about the way political leadership is viewing the unfair and unequal tax system revealed by your report and analysis, as well as that of the Pandora Papers? Are these revelations having an impact on the political leadership who the wealthiest families influence?
Well, I think it just shows how wealth captures our democratic system. Unfortunately, the Pandora Papers is going to turn up the heat in a lot of other places in the world, like Mexico, you and I were talking about, and other places where the politicians and the political class are directly implicated. Unfortunately, here in the United States, there are no politicians named, partly because the leaks came from offshore wealth services firms outside the U.S. If we had a couple good leaks here in the United States where we saw how our own politicians were kind of in the tank helping protect this system, that might help our reform process. But still we should move ahead because this system really is harming the quality of life for everyone else in the country.
So what do we miss in our understanding of how decisions are made at the very top of governance when we do not recognize the national impact of these family foundations?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, I think part of it's understanding the different ways in which wealthy families wield power, that philanthropy is part of that, that direct campaign support and the ability of wealthy families to run and finance a campaign to get rid of the estate tax. That's like about as selfish interest as you can possibly take. It's just understanding that all the arenas in which the super wealthy use their power to limit discussion or and essentially block opportunities for everybody else.
So the report states that the oversight role of the Internal Revenue Service has been decimated over the last few decades, particularly in its ability to monitor complex trust and tax loopholes. And this is all discussed on the front page of today's New York Times about what we're going to do about the IRS because President Biden wants IRS to have more access to certain information from banks, and the banking industry is trying to stop it. How can the image of the tax man be in any way rehabilitated as a means of fighting inequality? Because apparently, according to the Times, the banking industry is going to be running out all these ads in the very near future to make certain that the IRS doesn't have any increased or expanded power. So how can the image of the tax man in any way be rehabilitated?
Well, one is just to realize that, first of all, there should be a very clear function at the IRS, which is to watch the financial shell games of the richest 0.1%, people with $10 million or more, because that's where a huge amount of the corruption comes from. And that's where the expertise has been lost. So there's been this whole campaign against the IRS. And frankly, the IRS hasn't helped themselves because you're more likely to be audited for using the earned income credit than you are if you're using some exotic trust. And that's partly because the IRS's oversight ability to monitor the rich has been decimated. You need a certain expertise to follow the money. And it doesn't help when the Biden administration proposes things like, well, we're going to monitor $600 transactions from banks and require reporting on that. It's like, no, we don't really care about that. What we should really care about are $600 million transactions and, $600,000 transactions even, but, leave the little people alone. That's not where the true crimes are happening. And the IRS should be seen as an oversight body that defends society against the power of the wealthy and make sure they pay their fair share.
Why that low $600 amount? Do you think that was an attempt to get bipartisanism behind it?
I don't see how it gets anybody behind it. I think it's a whatever a judgment, a policy mistake. Just in the same way President Biden said, "Look, we're going to pay for all this, pandemic relief and infrastructure, and no one with income over $400,000 is going to pay any more taxes." Well, we should be talking the same about enforcement. The IRS already enforces existing tax laws on working folks. It's the super rich that are getting away with a heist here. So I think it has to be better targeted to win popular support. Win my support.
Yeah, exactly. The report also states Charles Koch, the president and CEO of petroleum company Koch Industries, serves on the National Petroleum Council. This is a government panel with the agency to represent the views of the oil and natural gas industries in advising, informing, and making recommendations to the Secretary of Energy, ensuring that Koch and his corporation have the ear of those writing energy policy. Who appointed Koch to this panel, and can he be removed, say, by the current Secretary of Energy or by the Democratic majority House? How is Charles Koch still in this position if we have the Democratic Party railing against his power, and now the Democratic Party has power in the White House, in the Senate, in Congress, and he's still sitting there on the National Petroleum Council?
Yeah. I mean, these accounts, these commissions and councils sometimes do have like term limited, you appoint somebody, they can't be removed. I'm sure, he was appointed by Trump or Bush or somebody with kind of an oil industry orientation. You see this, there's all these billionaires who are in the energy sector who are very intertangled with policy around energy. They personally are involved. They're personally on oversight commissions, and they're all huge donors to the Republican Party and probably to some Democrats as well. So, the reason why we're still on this sort of collision course around fossil fuels is because the fossil fuel industry is so powerful. They've been able to maintain their oil and gas subsidies, even though the industry is, you could consider it a rather mature industry. They don't need government help to start up, but that continues, and that's because they are just so beholden to the big energy sector donors and their politicians.
One last question for you, Chuck. We have been speaking with Chuck Collins, co-author of the Institute for Policy Studies report, Silver Spoon Oligarchs, How America's 50 Largest Inherited Wealth Dynasties Accelerate Inequality. Chuck is also author of the new book, The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Trillions. You can follow Chuck on Twitter at Chuck9921. So one last question for you, Chuck, and as we do with all of our guests, our final question is the question from hell, the question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer, or our audience is going to hate your response. We started by talking about Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk. The report states Chuck Feeney, the Irish-born billionaire, founded the duty-free shops and made millions and then billions as mass passenger aviation took off in the 1970s and 80s. A major proponent of giving while living, Feeney created the Atlantic Philanthropies and gave away over $8 billion over 3 decades. In a booklet about Atlantic's giving philosophy, Zero is the Hero, Finney said, "I see little reason to delay giving when so much good can be achieved through supporting worthwhile causes today. Besides, it's a lot more fun to give while you live than to give while you are dead." Today, Feeney has just $5 million left of his former $8 billion fortune and lives in a modest apartment in San Francisco, the exemplar of choosing timely giving over dynasty building. So, Chuck, why are Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk glorified and not Feeney? Why isn't Feeney in the media as much as those two?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think we should be lifting up the example of Chuck Feeney. Here's a guy who's a reluctant billionaire. He chose not to be a billionaire. He lives a very simple life. And there are other people who, kind of like Feeney, have chosen not to grab the whole pile, or take the case of Mackenzie Scott, who was married to Jeff Bezos. So she's got 60 billion or so of Amazon stock coming out of her divorce. Her pledge is to empty the vault. Last year she gave out $6 billion. She has got an aggressive plan to move money to the nonprofit sector. She does it without a lot of strings attached. So there are examples, few and far between, but there's examples of people who are turning their back on this dynastic wealth, and where they're not sitting around saying, how am I going to pass all this money on to my unborn children? Craig Newmark of Craigslist. Here's a guy, he could be a multi-billionaire, but he decided not to monetize Craigslist. eBay, the Omidyars, they monetized it. Now, if you sell something on eBay, you have to pay eBay. But lots of listings on Craigslist are free. And it's his philosophy. It's like, well, let's just keep that money in people's pockets. And so there are people who don't grab the whole pile. And I think we should lift them up as the real exemplars, the people that who understand that wealth is a function of the society, and that they have a responsibility to pay back the society who made it possible for them.
Chuck, it's great hearing from you again. Chuck, again, Chuck Collins is co-author of the Institute for Policy Studies report, Silver Spoon Oligarchs, How America's 50 Largest Inherited Wealth Dynasties Accelerate Inequality, author of the new book, The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Trillions. Thank you so much for being back on our show. It's great to hear your voice again. It's great to have you back on, and we're going to be bugging you again in the near future to have you back.
I sure hope so. Thanks, Chuck.
All right, take care, Chuck.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.